The door clicked behind me and I froze. The air smelled faintly of lobster and varnish, but it wasn't the room that stopped me. It was the way he was smiling. My brother, the one I trusted without question, leaned close to her, whispering in a language I didn't fully understand. They laughed. I could hear it even over the polite chatter around the table. Everyone else looked comfortable, unaware. Only I felt the sudden, sharp split of reality, that I had been invited but not fully included. That what I thought was family, shared history, and trust was suddenly a stage for something I wasn't meant to see. And the silence that followed their laughter said more than words ever could. The mornings always started the same way. I would wake before anyone else, the house still quiet, the sunlight thin as it stretched across the kitchen floor. I liked that hour. There was a simplicity to it. The kettle's whistle, the soft click of the toaster, the faint scent of coffee that had begun to seep from the carafe. My brother had always been there in the background, a constant presence that I never questioned, the kind of person you assumed would always act in ways you could predict. I would sit at the small wooden table in the corner, notebook open, sketching or writing fragments of thoughts, while he moved through his day with an easy confidence that I admired but never envied. He had a fiancée now. I had met her only a few times before the dinner invitation, and each encounter had been polite, measured. She smiled in the right moments, nodded in agreement, laughed where appropriate. She carried herself with precision as though every word and gesture had been carefully rehearsed. I assumed that was normal. That was what adulthood meant, people managing impressions, keeping faces tidy, maintaining trust without incident. I trusted her. I trusted him. I trusted that the small rituals we shared, family dinners, quiet weekends, phone calls that didn't have to be explained, were proof enough of the bonds that tied us together. Our home was predictable, and I clung to predictability. My brother and I had a rhythm that rarely faltered. On weekends, he would read in the living room while I wandered through the kitchen, occasionally breaking silence to ask about my sketches or my notes. He never judged. His guidance was gentle, reserved, almost invisible. And so I believed in him entirely, in the safety of that pattern, in the quiet understanding that no harm could come from those who loved you, or so I thought. There were small moments that could have been warnings, but they were easy to dismiss. A glance that lingered too long, a hushed conversation when I entered the room, the way certain phone calls ended abruptly when I walked past. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Misinterpretation, overthinking, my own imagination playing tricks. It felt safer to ignore the unease, to preserve the comfort of normalcy. At work, I carried the same quiet discipline. I observed rather than spoke, recorded rather than acted. I had learned early that power was not in volume or visibility. It was in patience, in the accumulation of details, in the quiet knowledge that you were watching while others revealed themselves without thought. My colleagues called me reliable, steady, dependable. They did not suspect the vigilance beneath the calm surface, the careful attention to every small shift in tone, every fleeting look. It was my nature, to see, to notice, and to hold it in without making a show of it. Trust, I realized, was both fragile and pervasive. It lived in routine, in habits, in the assurance that actions aligned with words. I trusted my brother because our history demanded it. I trusted his fiancée because she smiled at the right moments, because her voice was soft and measured, because everything she said reinforced the sense of family that had always been my anchor. I trusted that when I walked into their lives, I would be included, acknowledged, and respected. That trust was not naive. It was disciplined. I had learned to assess risk in silence, to notice inconsistencies without panic, to value observation over confrontation. And yet, even in that quiet routine, I carried the awareness of absence. Empty chairs at dinners, forgotten details, conversations that skipped over certain truths. I did not dwell on them, did not allow suspicion to cloud the calm waters of everyday life. I recorded them in the margins of my mind, tucked away in notebooks and memory, a catalog of small discrepancies. They were harmless, or so I thought. They were the undercurrent of what would become undeniable. By the time the invitation arrived for the dinner, I felt the balance of normal life. Safe, predictable, the kind of quiet trust that allows you to breathe fully without fear. I prepared to enter that evening with the same calm I carried every day, unaware that the patterns I relied on would be the very things disrupted in the most precise, deliberate way. I believed fully that I was part of the family I knew. That belief was absolute. It would be tested. It would fail. And I would feel the first tremors of betrayal before any words were spoken, before any glance confirmed what I was about to witness. The evening began like any other formal gathering, with the soft clink of cutlery, polite laughter, and the faint hum of classical music in the background. I arrived on time, dressed simply, quietly, hoping to blend into the edges of the room rather than draw attention. My brother greeted me with a quick hug, the kind that acknowledged familiarity without lingering. There was warmth in it, but already I noticed a slight stiffness in his posture, a tension I had not felt in our previous encounters. I brushed it off. Perhaps it was nerves. He always seemed more conscious of appearances when others were watching. His fiancée's family was impressive, and I could feel it the moment I stepped inside the dining room. Portraits lined the walls, their gold frames catching the soft light. Bookshelves were meticulously arranged, every volume carefully placed, titles facing outward with calculated precision. The room itself felt curated, rehearsed. I understood that this was their world, a display of power and respectability, but it unsettled me slightly. I told myself it was nothing, simply the environment they inhabited. As the evening progressed, small moments began to prick at the edges of my comfort. I asked a question about my brother's work, expecting a brief answer, but he hesitated, glanced toward his fiancée, and replied with a version that felt incomplete. I could see the flicker of conversation paused somewhere behind the smiles and polite nods. When I looked at her, her expression was neutral, controlled, as though she were listening, but not to me. The silence between words was heavier than the words themselves, though I convinced myself it was my imagination. At the table, everyone engaged in conversation that flowed smoothly, except when topics touched certain boundaries. There were moments when I would offer an observation or memory, something I assumed we all shared, but my words seemed to dissolve into the air. A laugh from someone else would punctuate my sentence, and it was as if what I had said never existed. I felt the quiet shift in attention, a subtle redirecting, but I did not voice discomfort. I have always been cautious about overreacting, about drawing unnecessary notice to moments that could be dismissed. I noticed the way the fiancé's father, the federal judge, observed my brother. Every nod, every raised eyebrow seemed loaded with expectation. My brother's responses were measured, precise, almost rehearsed. I could feel the tension in his posture, slight but present. It was nothing overt, nothing alarming, and yet it made my stomach tighten, a physical signal that something was off. I chose not to comment. I recorded it in silence, letting the observation settle quietly. At one point, I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretext of checking on the dessert. The room was empty except for the staff arranging plates. I caught a glimpse of my brother and his fiancée talking near the pantry door. Their voices were low, muted, but the tilt of their heads and the subtle smiles did not match the warmth of the conversation they displayed in the dining room. I did not understand what was said, only that it existed and that they shared it without me. A small knot formed in my chest. I ignored it. Dinner continued, and I forced myself back into the rhythm of polite conversation. I complimented the dishes, shared memories from our childhood, laughed when prompted. Every movement was careful, restrained. I noticed glances exchanged between others, quick, almost imperceptible. They did not seem sinister, not yet. But the undercurrent was undeniable. I was present, but not fully included. It was the faintest exclusion, the kind you could almost mistake for coincidence. I did not speak of it. Restraint had always been my method of survival, the quiet armor I relied upon. By the time the main course was cleared, a sense of unease had settled over me. It was small, almost invisible, but persistent. My brother's responses were precise but slightly delayed, the fiancé's smile too controlled, the judge's gaze too calculating. I reminded myself again. It was normal for new relationships to have subtle tensions. I told myself it was nothing. And yet, as I sipped the water at my place, watching the others converse without truly seeing me, a quiet thought emerged. The world I believed in, the one built on trust, routine, and shared history, was showing the first faint cracks. I did not acknowledge it aloud, did not let it surface in conversation. But in that moment, the tension beneath the table, in the subtle sidelong glances, the half-hidden smiles, began to whisper a warning that I could not yet name. The discomfort was small, insignificant, or so I hoped. The following days were ordinary on the surface. I returned to my routines, to work, to the quiet spaces where observation was safe and expected. But the dinner lingered, not as a memory of warmth, but as an echo of something I couldn't yet name. It started with small details, things I could have dismissed but couldn't. The way my brother's phone would vibrate just as I entered a room, and he would slip it into his pocket, the slight tension in his shoulders. The way his fiancé's eyes seemed to register more than she let on, glancing at me with a shadow of awareness I couldn't place. I began to notice inconsistencies in stories I had always taken at face value. My brother would reference events, conversations, or plans as if I had been absent, but I remembered clearly. I could see the subtle shifts in expression when I corrected him, a flicker of irritation that vanished the moment others looked my way. It was not overt, but it carried weight. Something was being concealed, carefully, deliberately. I cataloged these instances silently, aware that my role was not to confront yet, but to understand. Emails arrived that seemed routine but contained omissions. Invitations I had once expected to receive were filtered through my brother's fiancée or ignored entirely. I noticed minor alterations in family schedules, adjustments that excluded me without explanation. Each instance alone was almost negligible, but together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I realized with a tightening chest that my presence was being circumscribed, carefully defined. I was allowed proximity, but not access. At work, I found myself distracted, replaying snippets of the dinner. I recalled the way my brother's fiancée had leaned in toward him, her voice lowering, subtle gestures that carried unspoken meaning. It had felt innocuous at first, a natural intimacy between two people in a relationship. But as I traced the memory, the faint lines of exclusion became clearer. My brother's laughter had shifted, the way he responded to her subtle cues. It was no longer the brother I thought I knew, the one whose instincts were always aligned with shared history. Something had changed, and I was only beginning to perceive it. I spoke briefly to my mother about the evening, attempting to gauge her perspective. She had noticed little. "They were polite," she said. Everything seemed fine. Her words, meant to reassure, only deepened my unease. If an observer like her, familiar with family dynamics, saw nothing, then the omissions and the subtle exclusions were intentional, invisible only to those who had not yet been included in the circle. I realized then that the stakes were more delicate than I had imagined. A message arrived from my brother, casual in tone, but I noticed the phrasing was different than his usual. "Glad you could make it. Hope you enjoyed yourself." The words were simple, but the subtext was deliberate. He had acknowledged my presence, yet it was hollow. There was no warmth, no sense of inclusion, only the performance of acknowledgement. It was a line carefully drawn. I existed, but only as a shadow of participation. I began to watch more closely, noting reactions from others as I spoke. The judge's gaze occasionally lingered longer than polite attention required, assessing, measuring. My brother's fiancée smiled politely, nodded when I spoke, but her body language was subtly reserved. When the conversation turned to family history, I found myself interrupted, redirected, as if my perspective was inconvenient. These were not mistakes. They were carefully executed signals. By the end of the week, I realized I could no longer ignore the signs. The world I believed in, the one of trust, of predictable loyalty, was showing fractures. I had always believed that actions and words would align, that family bonds created a safe framework. But now, inconsistencies, omissions, and controlled interactions painted a different picture. The truth had not yet surfaced, but the red flags were unmistakable. I did not confront anyone. I did not speak. Observation remained my only ally. The quiet cataloging of behavior, the patient recording of small betrayals had always been my method. It was not denial, it was preparation. And in the stillness of my apartment that night, I acknowledged a growing certainty. Something had shifted, and I was no longer fully seen. The trust I had relied upon was being tested in ways I could not yet articulate, and the first cracks in what I believed to be secure had begun to widen. I understood then, in that quiet, restrained way I always did, that awareness was both weapon and shield. I would watch, I would wait, and the truth would reveal itself, not with noise or spectacle, but in moments like these. Subtle, devastating, undeniable. The days that followed brought more than discomfort. They brought a subtle, corrosive pressure that I could neither name nor confront directly. Conversations that had once been easy now carried an undercurrent of tension. My questions were deflected, observations dismissed, and any expression of unease met with faint irritation or polite disbelief. My brother, once so dependable, now responded with a careful precision that left no room for disagreement, no room for me to assert the reality I was beginning to perceive. It started with small remarks. At first, I convinced myself they were harmless. A comment about my overthinking an event, or the suggestion that I had misremembered a conversation we had shared. But the more they occurred, the more deliberate they felt. My brother would casually reframe incidents, always with a smile, always with enough plausibility to make me question myself. I caught myself replaying words, examining my tone, doubting my perception. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet it carried a weight that settled in my chest. His fiancée participated with quiet efficiency. She would nod knowingly, her agreement implicit, reinforcing the narrative he had crafted. Occasionally, she would interject, "You must be imagining it," or "That didn't happen that way," each time reinforcing the invisible walls forming around me. It was never loud or overt, but the effect was unmistakable. I was being made to doubt my own understanding, my own memories. The words were surgical, designed not to hurt openly, but to reshape reality itself. I found myself pausing more often, hesitating before speaking, measuring every phrase, every gesture. My natural instinct to engage had become a liability. The room, the house, the conversations, everything seemed to operate under rules I was only beginning to perceive. I began to notice the silences that followed my interjections, the quick exchanges between others that I could not hear, the subtle shifts in posture and gaze. Each interaction reinforced the quiet but undeniable message. I was not to be fully trusted with knowledge or presence. When I confronted a minor inconsistency directly, my brother laughed softly, a sound that seemed intended to dissolve tension. "You're imagining things," he said, and then quickly added, "Don't take it personally. Everyone misremembers sometimes." The words themselves were harmless on the surface, but beneath them lay an assertion of control, a reminder that my perceptions were not to be trusted. It was not cruelty overtly displayed. It was authority masked in calm reassurance. Even our parents, those I had assumed would recognize the truth, seemed uncertain. When I mentioned subtle exclusions or observed shifts, they offered explanations that made sense on the surface. "People are busy," my mother would say. "They didn't mean anything by it," my father added. I wanted to press further, to insist that something was wrong, but I knew the pattern by now. Persistence could be reframed as paranoia. Restraint had to be my method, patience my shield. I noticed the catalog of small betrayals growing around me. Invitations ignored, information withheld, conversations rerouted. Each event alone could be dismissed, but together they formed a web of exclusion. Yet when I attempted to acknowledge it, the narrative shifted back onto me. I was the one at fault, the one overreacting, the one misunderstanding. It was a delicate, almost invisible form of authority, exerted not through force, but through the shaping of perception. Even at work, I felt the tension carrying over. I replayed the conversations in my mind, noticing how easily I had been made to question my memory, my instincts. The skill required for such subtle dismissal was remarkable, but it did not make it any less isolating. I was beginning to recognize a pattern. The more I resisted, the more carefully they adjusted reality around me, ensuring that doubt would settle first in my own mind. Late at night, in the quiet of my apartment, I traced the sequences again, recording each interaction in detail. I did not write for vindication. I wrote for clarity, for proof, for the slow accumulation of evidence that could not be ignored. The emotional cost was heavy, tension lodged in my chest, awareness pressing against the restraint I had always relied upon, but I did not release it outwardly. I could not. The world was observing, and my power lay in patience, in quiet endurance, in the careful noting of what others sought to hide. By the end of the week, I felt the first sharp ache of understanding. I was being manipulated, my trust weaponized, my perception reframed. The people I had believed in, the brother I had relied upon, the family I had assumed was constant, were quietly reshaping reality around me, excluding me without notice, dismissing me without confrontation. The betrayal had begun, not with a shout, but with silence, subtle authority, and the quiet assertion of control that left me questioning myself. I remained still. I observed. I recorded. Restraint was no longer optional. It was survival. It began with a single, careless detail, a document left open on the kitchen counter, the soft hum of a printer in the hallway. I had come to the house under the pretense of a quiet weekend visit, expecting routine conversation, easy meals, familiar gestures. Instead, I found something that did not belong in my world, something that confirmed a growing suspicion I had tried to ignore. The paper contained names, dates, and plans that were never mentioned aloud, plans that excluded me entirely. My chest tightened, but I did not speak. Observation, patience, and silence were my allies now. I lingered in the hallway, pretending to adjust a book on the shelf, while the others moved through the kitchen unaware. I memorized the details quickly, noting the precision with which events were recorded, the careful alignment of names and responsibilities. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for, but I knew. I had always noticed the small things, the patterns others overlooked. This was deliberate. The omission of my presence was deliberate. The first witness appeared quietly. My mother, helping with dinner preparations, paused as she noticed the same document. Her eyes flicked to mine, a brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. No words were spoken, but the understanding was mutual. She had seen it, she knew what it meant, and yet she said nothing. That silence carried weight. In that moment, I realized the truth was not just in what I observed. It was reinforced by witnesses who dared not speak, who existed in the spaces between the words. Later, a casual conversation at the table revealed more. My brother and his fiancée referenced a meeting, a plan, an arrangement I had never been invited to, never informed about. The phrasing was light offhand, as though I had no role to play. My questions were met with vague reassurances, polite smiles, and subtle redirects. The reality was clear. I had been excluded. They were creating a narrative without me, a world where my presence was unnecessary or inconvenient. I found myself walking through the house, tracing the edges of interactions I had taken for granted. Notes left on counters, small adjustments in seating arrangements, subtle signals in the way conversations paused when I entered a room, all were pieces of the same puzzle. It was not malicious in the traditional sense. It was calculated, methodical, almost professional in execution. But the emotional cost was undeniable. Every overlooked detail, every silent correction of my perception, was a cut to the trust I had relied upon. Evidence accumulated quietly. Emails I was never copied on, messages that disappeared from threads, invitations I discovered only by accident. Each was a confirmation, a quiet assertion of control over my presence, my knowledge, my understanding. The betrayal was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It existed in patterns, in omissions, in the small ways the world was being rewritten without my consent. I began to notice the fiancé's subtle gestures of authority. A nod here, a glance there, the careful placement of words in conversations. She was orchestrating the environment, shaping interactions, guiding perception. My brother, once the steady anchor I trusted, now participated willingly, his compliance complete but understated. The dynamics of power were visible only to those patient enough to observe, those disciplined enough to notice the quiet manipulation. Late that evening, I discovered the second piece of proof. A calendar, shared between my brother and his fiancée, revealed a sequence of events, dinners, and meetings that had been deliberately structured to prevent my participation. I traced the entries, noting times, locations, and participants. Each exclusion was precise. There was no chaos, no error, only intention. The pattern was undeniable. I did not confront them. I did not demand explanations. I merely observed, catalogued, and internalized the evidence. The emotional weight pressed against me, a quiet ache in the chest, but I held it in. Restraint had become a conscious effort, a discipline I could not abandon. I realized that acting too soon could dismantle the subtle advantage I now possessed: knowledge, clarity, and the quiet accumulation of truth. The partial exposure was a turning point. I understood now that I had been sidelined, that my trust had been exploited, that my presence was managed like a variable in a carefully controlled system. And yet, the full story was still hidden. There were gaps, silent corners where intentions remained unseen, actions obscured. But the framework was emerging. I retreated to my notebook, documenting every interaction, every omission, every observed gesture. I did not need confirmation from anyone else. The evidence was already undeniable. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It existed in tangible form. I realized that the slow accumulation of proof, the patient observation, was beginning to shift the balance. Knowledge itself was power, quiet but undeniable, and it was the first step toward understanding the full extent of what had been done. By the end of that night, I understood the stakes. The world I had trusted, the family I had relied upon, was not what it seemed. But with restraint and careful observation, I could map the contours of deception. I could see the beginnings of a reversal, though it was distant, subtle, and quiet. And in that stillness, I recognized the cost: a trust broken, a betrayal unfolding, and the heavy weight of clarity pressing silently against my chest. The days that followed the partial exposure were charged with a tension I could feel in my bones, though the world around me remained outwardly calm. I arrived at my brother's home under the pretense of a casual visit, but every step, every movement felt carefully measured, weighed against the invisible script they were following. The atmosphere was different now, not openly hostile, not yet, but the careful architecture of exclusion had begun to shift into something more aggressive, more insistent. The quiet manipulation I had documented was no longer subtle. It was tightening like a cord around my presence. I noticed the first escalation in the smallest of gestures. A book I had intended to borrow was suddenly misplaced, left on a high shelf just out of reach. Invitations to family outings were adjusted subtly. Times shifted, participants modified, all with precision. My brother's fiancée, once polite and distant, now engaged in what felt like active monitoring of my attention, steering conversations away from certain topics, asking questions that seemed innocent but were calculated to keep me on the margins. Every action carried intent. Every movement enforced boundaries I was meant to respect without understanding them. The tension became more tangible during a dinner we were all supposed to share. I entered the dining room, smiling politely, attempting to carry the same calm I always did. My brother greeted me with a quick nod. His fiancée's smile was measured. The judge's gaze lingered, assessing, weighing. It was the first time I realized the dynamic had shifted from exclusion to control. I spoke, offering a comment on a shared memory, but it was interrupted before I could finish. My words were not only dismissed, they were replaced, rewritten by the others in real time. A subtle but unmistakable assertion of authority. I retreated into observation, watching every detail, noting every pattern. Their coordination was precise. My brother's laughter, his nods, even the pauses in conversation, all choreographed to exclude my agency. It was not overt hostility, but a system of control. I had seen the evidence before, but now the application was active. They were not merely omitting me. They were actively shaping the environment to maintain dominance, to assert a hierarchy in which I was deliberately marginalized. One evening, a seemingly innocent interaction revealed the extent of their planning. I asked a question about an upcoming family event, only to be met with a carefully constructed denial. "I thought you knew," my brother said, the tone light but firm. "We already discussed it." I had no memory of any discussion. His fiancée added softly, "Perhaps you missed it. We mentioned it a while ago." The coordinated response was deliberate. It was not meant to humiliate openly. It was meant to make me doubt myself. The gaslighting had evolved into a system of social control, with multiple participants reinforcing the narrative. I began to notice how the tension affected their demeanor. The fiancé's subtle dominance became more evident. Slight shifts in posture, intentional placement of objects, questions that guided attention, even gentle touches that reinforced her presence. My brother, compliant and disciplined, followed the cues with an ease that was almost terrifying. Every move was calculated, controlled, deliberate. I recognized then that the power imbalance was no longer just in perception. It had been institutionalized within their behavior. Late at night, I retreated to my own apartment and reviewed the evidence I had collected. Notes, messages, patterns, dates, and omissions. The full picture was beginning to take shape. The exclusion, the subtle manipulations, the carefully orchestrated interactions, they were all part of a larger plan, a structure designed to manage me, to control how I moved through their lives. I felt the weight of it, a pressing realization that the stakes were higher than I had imagined. Even in silence, the consequences were present. Friends who reached out were subtly discouraged, invitations diverted, information filtered. I observed the pattern across multiple interactions, a network of small, precise actions designed to reinforce their control. Every interaction with them carried a lesson. I was not to act, I was not to intervene, I was to exist within the carefully defined boundaries they created. Resistance was possible, but it would be noticed, monitored, and corrected. The culmination of this escalation became clear one evening when I arrived at the house unannounced, curious about a family gathering that had been scheduled without my knowledge. I walked through the rooms slowly, observing the interactions. My presence was acknowledged, but only at the level of necessity. Conversations paused briefly, eyes flickered, and then everything resumed as if I were invisible. I realized then that the escalation had reached its peak. I was not merely excluded. I was contained, observed, and managed. By the end of that week, I understood the full measure of what had been set against me. It was not a matter of malice alone, it was strategy. Subtle, quiet, methodical. The escalation had solidified the power imbalance. I had been sidelined, gaslit, doubted, and restrained. Yet I remained calm. I did not act impulsively. I recorded. I observed. I held the knowledge quietly, knowing that the moment for confrontation had not yet arrived. That patience and precision would be my only advantage in a system designed to deny me agency. And in the stillness of that night, I felt the weight of what was to come. The game was no longer abstract. The stakes were defined. The betrayal was no longer theoretical. It was active, deliberate, and undeniable. The truth had settled over me like a slow, suffocating fog. Each day revealed more omissions, more deliberate exclusions, and more manipulations designed to make me doubt myself. My brother, once a constant I trusted without question, now operated within a carefully constructed system of authority, guided subtly but unmistakably by his fiancée. The pattern was clear. The betrayal was not sudden. It was cumulative, a quiet accumulation of evidence, moments, and gestures, and I could no longer ignore it. I felt the first sharp pang of anger one afternoon while reviewing messages I had never received. Invitations, casual remarks, acknowledgments, all absent. My chest tightened as I read what had been said without me, what had been planned without me, what had been quietly redirected around my presence. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, to confront the reality of their intentions. But I did not. Restraint had been my method from the start, and now it was the only shield I could trust. Any overt reaction could be used against me. Any display of emotion could become evidence of weakness, a validation of the narrative they had constructed. I recalled every subtle act, the whispers that paused when I entered a room, the laughter that followed private comments, the way documents and emails seemed to vanish from my notice. Each moment alone could have been dismissed. Together, they formed a mosaic of intentional exclusion. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest, a constant, quiet ache that I could not speak, could not release. It was during a family gathering that I recognized the emotional breaking point. The room was filled with polite conversation, clinking cutlery, and soft laughter. I noticed the subtle coordination again, my brother's glances, the careful placement of words, the measured nods from his fiancée. When I attempted to contribute, I was redirected, dismissed with a smile, my words replaced seamlessly by their narrative. I realized that the betrayal was not only about exclusion, it was about shaping reality itself. I was being managed, contained, and made to question my own understanding of events. I retreated to the quiet of my room that night, alone with my thoughts and the evidence I had meticulously recorded. I traced each interaction, each omission, each subtle manipulation. The realization was heavy, almost physical. The people I had trusted, relied upon, loved, my brother, his fiancée, even family members who saw but said nothing, were complicit in a system designed to marginalize me. The weight of that awareness pressed on me, a silent but undeniable cost. I considered confrontation, the release of anger, the assertion of truth, but I knew the consequences. The system was precise. Any reaction could be reframed, any emotion weaponized. To act without full control would be to lose what little agency remained. I understood that power was not in noise or spectacle. It was in patience, observation, and the careful accumulation of undeniable truth. Restraint was no longer optional. It was the only method of survival. As I sat quietly, notebook open, recording the sequence of events, I allowed myself a brief acknowledgement of grief. I mourned the trust that had been broken, the bond I had assumed would never fracture. I mourned the realization that the world I had believed in, a world of shared history, predictable loyalty, and subtle understanding, had been quietly reshaped around my exclusion. The grief was silent, restrained, but deep. It lodged itself in the chest, pressing against the calm I maintained, a reminder that awareness came at a cost. I recognized, too, the moral dimension of the choice I faced. I could respond impulsively, assert my presence, demand acknowledgement, or I could hold the knowledge, preserve my dignity, and wait. To act without clarity would be to surrender control to their narrative. To remain quiet, disciplined, and observant, however painful, was to retain agency. The emotional breaking point was not the loss of trust. It was the acceptance that restraint, observation, and patience were now my only forms of power. In the stillness, I understood that betrayal is rarely loud. It is subtle, accumulative, and strategic. It thrives in silence, in omission, in careful management of perception. The emotional and moral cost is heavy, but recognition and patience are heavier still. I could feel the strain in my shoulders, the tightness in my chest, but I did not release it. I did not cry, I did not yell, I did not confront. I recorded, I cataloged, I waited. By the end of that night, the clarity was absolute. I would continue to observe. I would maintain restraint. I would endure. The system that sought to marginalize me had not yet won, not entirely, because I had knowledge they could not erase. The emotional breaking point was not the collapse of spirit, but the quiet acceptance of reality, the disciplined understanding of cost, and the preparation for the slow unraveling that would come next. And in that quiet, heavy acceptance, I understood the unspoken truth. Power exists not in reaction, but in comprehension. I was no longer naive. I was aware. I was ready. The first undeniable consequence arrived subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the rhythm of daily life. I had continued my quiet observation, cataloging patterns, omissions, and moments of exclusion, waiting for the culmination of what I already knew, that the system built to contain me would eventually falter under its own precision. And when it did, the exposure was not dramatic. It was quiet, devastating, and meticulous. It began with a small error. A message intended to remain hidden was sent to the wrong recipient, a slip of a name, a misaligned date. I noticed immediately. My heart did not race, my pulse did not spike. Instead, a calm focus took over. I traced the message, examined the context, and cataloged what it revealed. The careful orchestration that had so effectively marginalized me was imperfect. The cracks, previously invisible, had begun to widen. I witnessed subtle reactions in real time. My brother's fiancée glanced briefly at the printer tray, her expression betraying fleeting concern. My brother, usually composed and precise, hesitated for a moment before responding to a query he had rehearsed countless times. The system had been effective, but no system is flawless. I watched, silently noting the signs of disarray, the minor shifts that hinted at vulnerability. The power they had exercised so deliberately was now showing the first tremors of consequence. Evidence continued to surface in unexpected ways. An invitation that had been deliberately redirected arrived in my hands, unsigned, unannounced, revealing plans I had been excluded from for months. Conversations intended to exclude me accidentally reached my ears, carrying details that contradicted the carefully curated narrative. Even the judge's occasional nods, previously measured and controlled, faltered ever so slightly when I asked a simple question, a factual clarification. I began to see the system unravel in small, precise movements, each one verifiable, undeniable. I did not celebrate. I did not confront. I did not speak. The knowledge of their errors and the unfolding consequences was enough. I maintained silence, a quiet record of observation, noting every reaction, every inconsistency. The emotional weight pressed on me, but I did not allow it to spill into confrontation. The truth, once fully acknowledged, carried its own power. It required no amplification. The consequences extended beyond isolated errors. The network of exclusion that had been meticulously maintained began to collapse under its own precision. Friends and family, who had been quietly aware, began to react in small ways, brief acknowledgments, subtle corrections, shifts in conversation. Witnesses emerged, unplanned and uncoordinated, confirming what I had known. Their presence did not absolve the betrayers, but it reinforced the reality I had observed for months. The narrative they had sought to control was no longer theirs alone. I noticed changes in behavior, small but significant. My brother's fiancée, once effortlessly commanding the flow of conversation, now hesitated. My brother, usually calm and composed, displayed micro-expressions of concern, an almost imperceptible flinch when details were corrected in my presence. The system they had relied upon to contain me was fragile, and the consequences were rippling outward quietly, inexorably. Even so, the outcome was restrained. There was no confrontation, no loud reckoning, no spectacle. The consequences unfolded in measured, deliberate ways as the system of exclusion revealed its imperfections. My presence, once minimized and controlled, became a quiet force of recognition. The weight of truth pressed against the edges of their careful construction, destabilizing it, exposing it. I recorded each moment meticulously, not for vengeance, not for validation, but as a ledger of reality. The betrayers had acted deliberately, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Each error, each slip, each moment of exposure confirmed what I had known. The power imbalance they had relied upon was fragile, and control was never absolute. By the end of that week, the pattern was undeniable. The quiet truths I had observed, the omissions, the redirections, the subtle control, they all bore fruit in the form of exposure. The system could no longer function as intended. And yet, even as consequences unfolded, there was no celebration, no victory, no declaration. The truth existed quietly, heavy and undeniable, reshaping the world around me without spectacle. In the stillness, I understood the cost, the weight, and the subtle justice of restraint. The betrayal had been extensive, deliberate, and precise. The consequences were equally quiet, precise, and inevitable. Power, once wielded with such quiet authority, had been revealed for what it truly was: fragile, fallible, and subject to the observation of those it sought to control. The house was silent when I arrived that evening, long after the others had left. Plates cleared, glasses stacked, the faint scent of meals lingering in the air, everything in place, polished, controlled. I moved slowly through the rooms, noticing the small signs of life that had once seemed ordinary. The slight dent in the table from where a hand rested too long, the faded spot on the carpet where a chair had always been, the faint echo of voices in the hall. It was familiar, yet now it felt different, an archive of what had happened, a record of absence and inclusion measured in precision. No one confronted me. No one apologized, no one acknowledged the fracture that had rippled through every interaction, every gesture, every carefully constructed smile. And yet the truth was undeniable. The subtle system of exclusion, manipulation, and quiet authority had been exposed in its own imperfections. I did not speak. I did not react. The knowledge, fully held and meticulously recorded, carried its own gravity. That gravity was enough. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, the dim light of early evening casting long shadows across familiar shapes. The world outside was ordinary, unknowing, unaware of the quiet dismantling that had taken place within these walls. My brother, his fiancée, even those who had witnessed yet remained silent, all of them existed in the aftermath of a system that had failed to fully control reality. Their power, precise and deliberate, had been revealed as fragile, imperfect, human. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders loosening ever so slightly. There was no victory here, no spotlight, no recognition of endurance or insight. Only observation, restraint, and the heavy weight of truth. The silence was thick but steady. I had seen, I had noted, I had endured. And in that quiet, I understood something fundamental. The world does not offer justice in applause. It offers only consequence, subtle, unflinching, and often unnoticed. I left the house shortly after, closing the door softly behind me. The world outside was ordinary, and I moved within it with the calm knowledge that what had been hidden was now quietly known, indelible, and impossible to ignore.